April 30th, 1943, 4:37 a.m., 1.2 nautical miles off Huelva, Spain. Lieutenant Commander Bill Jewell surfaces HMS Seraph in complete darkness. No battle stations, no torpedo runs, just silence. He opens the forward hatch and stares at a steel canister welded shut 3 days ago in a Scottish port. Inside is a corpse, dressed in a Royal Marines uniform, chained to a briefcase, loaded with documents so sensitive that if they reach the wrong hands, the next Allied invasion will turn into a slaughter. The body isn't a soldier who died in combat. It's a vagrant, a suicide, a man whose death certificate reads, "Nothing suspicious." Now he's about to change the course of World War II. Jewell's crew lifts the canister onto the deck. They work fast. No talking. They open it, release the body into the Atlantic swell. Watch it drift toward the Spanish coast. From this moment forward, the invasion of Europe belongs to a Spanish fisherman who might report the body or steal the briefcase, coroner who might notice the corpse died weeks before it drowned, a German intelligence officer who might smell a trap, and a lie so detailed it has love letters, theater ticket stubs, and a photograph of a fiancé who doesn't exist. What happens next takes 47 days. The Germans will reposition entire divisions. Sicily will be left exposed, and 160,000 Allied troops will land on beaches that should have been defended, because the enemy believed a dead man's secrets. All because British intelligence understood something the Wehrmacht didn't. In war, belief is more powerful than truth. The man who designed this operation wasn't a general. His name was Ewan Montague, born July 29, 1901, in London. Son of a banker, educated at Oxford, trained as a barrister. When World War II began, Montague wasn't storming beaches or flying bombers. He was sitting in a basement office in Whitehall, working for a department that officially didn't exist. By 1943, the British intelligence community had learned a brutal lesson. Germany had the strongest army in Europe. Better tanks, better training, better officers. But Germany had one weakness. They believed what they wanted to believe. And if you could control what they believed, you could control where they sent their armies. Montague didn't invent deception, but he perfected it. In early 1943, he walks into a meeting with a proposal so disturbing that several officers initially refused to participate. Use a corpse to deliver fake invasion plans. Not hide the invasion, not obscure it. Replace reality entirely. The plan requires something most military operations avoid: no backup. Once the body enters the water, there's no retrieval, no correction, no second attempt. Either Spain finds it and Germany believes it, or 160,000 men die on a beach the enemy was waiting for. In the intelligence world, this kind of operation has a name: irreversible commitment. And in April 1943, with the Mediterranean campaign hanging in the balance, Montague and his team prepare to make death itself a weapon. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every view helps bring more stories like this to life. By early 1943, the Allies were winning. But winning in World War II didn't mean what most people think. It meant you'd stopped losing quite as badly. North Africa had been secured after 3 years of brutal desert warfare. Rommel's Africa Corps, once considered invincible, had finally been broken at El Alamein and crushed in Tunisia. For the first time since 1939, the Allies controlled territory they could actually use. But controlling North Africa created a new problem. What comes next? The answer was obvious. Painfully, dangerously obvious. Sicily, The island sat like a stepping stone between North Africa and mainland Europe. Control Sicily and you control the Mediterranean. Control the Mediterranean and you can strike at Italy, the weakest link in the Axis. Alliance. Every Allied planner knew it. Every German planner knew it. And that's exactly why it was a problem. In military strategy, there's a principle that doesn't get taught in war movies. Predictability is a death sentence. If your enemy knows where you're coming, they don't need to be everywhere. They just need to be there. Waiting. Dug in. Ready. And in 1943, Germany had one of the most experienced, disciplined, and adaptive militaries in human history. They didn't need to guess where the Allies would strike. Logic told them everything. Sicily was the only move that made sense. So German High Command began reinforcing the island. Troops redeployed from the Eastern Front. Coastal defenses strengthened. Luftwaffe squadrons repositioned. Panzer divisions moved into staging areas across southern Italy. The math was simple and terrifying. If Germany guessed correctly, and they were guessing correctly, the Allied invasion of Sicily would hit fortified beaches defended by battle-hardened troops who'd been preparing for months. Amphibious assaults are already nightmares. Soldiers packed into landing craft. No cover, no retreat. Crossing open water toward machine gun nests and artillery emplacements. Now add this: an enemy that knows you're coming. The invasion would be a slaughter. Tens of thousands of casualties in the first hours. Units wiped out before they reached the beach. Naval support unable to suppress dug-in defenders. The entire Mediterranean campaign, maybe the entire war, stalled before it began. And even if the Allies succeeded, the cost would be catastrophic. Months of delay. Massive losses. Weakened forces unable to press the advantage into Italy. Churchill knew it. Eisenhower knew it. Every Allied commander reviewing the Sicily invasion plans knew it. They were about to walk into a meat grinder. This is where most wars are decided. Not by courage, not by firepower, by information asymmetry. Whoever knows more, or whoever makes the enemy believe the wrong thing, controls the battlefield before the first shot is fired. The Allies couldn't change the strategic logic. Sicily was the obvious target. There was no better option. But they could change what the Germans believed was obvious. That's when British intelligence shifted from passive observation to active warfare. They stopped asking, "What does the enemy know?" and started asking, "What do we want the enemy to think they know?" This wasn't about hiding the invasion. It was about replacing it. What if the Germans believed, truly, deeply believed, that Sicily was a diversion? A feint meant to distract from the real invasion elsewhere? What if they thought the Allies were actually targeting Greece, or Sardinia, or southern France? What if German intelligence intercepted documents proving it? Not rumors, not speculation, hard evidence, classified orders, invasion plans with dates, units, and objectives. If the Germans believe that, they do what every time rational military does. Redeploy. Reinforce the real target. Deprioritize Sicily as a secondary concern. And when the Allies landed on Sicilian beaches in July, they'd face lighter defenses, fewer troops, and confusion instead of coordinated resistance. Deception wouldn't guarantee victory, but it would turn a potential disaster into a fighting chance. The problem was scale. Small deceptions were easy. Plant a fake radio message, leak a false report to a double agent, create rumors through neutral channels. But this required something bigger. Something Germany's intelligence apparatus, one of the most sophisticated in the world, would actually trust. You can't fool the Abwehr with whispers. You need proof, physical, verified, authentic in every detail except the truth. That's when Ewan Montague and his team realized what they needed. Not a spy, not a radio intercept, not a leaked document. A body, a dead British officer, carrying orders, washed ashore in neutral territory where German agents operate freely. Someone Germany would examine, investigate, and ultimately believe, because everything about him, from his uniform to the receipts in his pocket, would be real. Except the invasion plans. The operation had a name, Mincemeat, and it required something most military minds couldn't accept: total commitment to a lie. Because once the body entered the water, there was no stopping it, no adjusting the story, no backup plan. Either the Germans believed it, or 160,000 men would pay the price. British intelligence in World War II didn't look like the movies. No James Bond, no car chases, no gadgets hidden in fountain pens, just exhausted men in basement offices in Whitehall, reading reports until their eyes burned, cross-referencing surveillance photographs, debating the reliability of double agents who might be triple agents. The work was meticulous, unglamorous, brutal in its own way. And by 1943, it had fundamentally changed. For most of military history, intelligence meant gathering information, intercept enemy communications, map their positions, count their divisions, learn their plans, then report what you know and let commanders decide what to do with it. But World War II forced a different evolution, because by 1943, both sides had become too good at gathering intelligence. The Germans had the Abwehr, disciplined, experienced, embedded in neutral countries across Europe. The Allies had Ultra, decrypting German communications through captured Enigma machines, reading orders before some Wehrmacht officers did. Everyone was watching everyone. So intelligence stopped being about knowing more. It became about controlling what the enemy thinks they know. Not observation, manipulation. Not defense, offense. The British called it deception warfare. And the department responsible operated out of a nondescript building in London under a designation so bland it sounded like a filing error. The London Controlling Section. Its mandate? Make the enemy commit forces to the wrong place at the wrong time based on false information they believe is true. This wasn't a support role. This was a frontline operation fought with lies instead of bullets. The architect of Operation Mincemeat was Ewan Montague, 41 years old in 1943. A barrister by training, sharp mind, calm demeanor. The kind of man who could dismantle a legal argument in 3 sentences and make you thank him for it. But Montague wasn't working in courtrooms anymore. He was working in Section 17M, Naval Intelligence Division's Deception Unit. His job? Invent stories convincing enough to fool the Third Reich. He didn't work alone. Charles Cholmondeley, an RAF flight lieutenant, creative, unconventional, the kind of officer who suggested ideas that made senior commanders uncomfortable. John Godfrey, Director of Naval Intelligence, Montague's superior. A man who understood that wars aren't won by following doctrine, but by breaking it when doctrine becomes predictable. And dozens of others, forgers, pathologists, identity specialists, writers, people whose names would never appear in history books, but whose work would decide whether the Mediterranean campaign succeeded or failed. They were not naive about what they were doing. These weren't men who believed deception was glorious or heroic. They understood exactly what it meant. If the lie worked, thousands of soldiers would live. If it failed, thousands would die. And they would be responsible. Not the generals giving the orders, Not the soldiers storming the beaches. Them. The men in the basement who built a fake identity and chained it to a corpse. There's a moral weight to that kind of work that doesn't exist in conventional combat. A soldier fires at an enemy. The enemy fires back. There's clarity in that, however brutal. But intelligence officers operate in a space where clarity doesn't exist. You don't see the people your decisions kill or save. You only see reports, statistics, behavior, changes in enemy troop movements. Success is abstract. Failure is measured in body counts you'll never witness. And yet, they kept working. Because they'd accepted something most civilians never have to. Truth alone doesn't win wars. Strategy does. Psychology does. Belief does. If the enemy believes the wrong thing strongly enough, they'll do your work for you. The radical idea at the heart of Operation Mincemeat wasn't tactical. It was philosophical. Most deception operations try to obscure the truth. Hide troop movements, camouflage supply lines, spread misinformation to create doubt. But Montague and his team asked a different question. What if we don't hide the truth? What if we replace it entirely? Not make them uncertain about Sicily, but make them certain about Greece. Not confuse their intelligence networks, but give them evidence so credible they stop looking for alternatives. This required something deeper than clever forgeries. It required understanding how people trust. Intelligence analysts don't believe wild claims. They believe evidence that fits patterns they recognize. A dead officer washing ashore isn't suspicious by itself. Soldiers die at sea. Documents in a briefcase aren't suspicious. Officers carry classified materials. But a dead officer with no personal effects? Suspicious. A briefcase full of perfectly typed invasion plans, with no margin notes, no coffee stains, no signs of actual use? Suspicious. The lie had to be imperfect to be believed. It had to feel lived in, used, human. That's when Montague realized what they were really building. Not a cover story, a life. Complete enough to survive scrutiny, detailed enough to feel real, flawed enough to be trusted. And then they'd kill him. In a January 1943 meeting, Montague presented the concept to a room of senior intelligence officers. Some were intrigued, some were horrified. One asked the question everyone was thinking. Are we really going to use a corpse to lie to the Germans? Montague's response was quiet, factual, devastating. We're going to use everything we have, and if a dead man can save living ones, then yes. The room went silent. Not because anyone disagreed, but because everyone understood what came next. They'd have to find a body. They'd have to build an identity convincing enough to fool the Abwehr, and they'd have to accept that once the plan began, there was no way to stop it. The lie would either work, or it would kill the invasion before it started. By February 1943, Operation Mincemeat was approved. Now came the disturbing part. His name was Major William Martin, Royal Marines, acting major, attached to Combined Operations Headquarters. He had a service number, 148228. He had a rank, a posting, a chain of command. And he had never drawn a breath. Creating a fake identity for intelligence work isn't new. Spies have used cover identities for centuries. False names, forged papers, memorized backstories. But those identities only need to survive casual conversation. Major William Martin had to survive autopsy, investigation, and German intelligence analysis. He couldn't just have a name. He had to have a life, and Montague's team understood something crucial about how people perceive reality. Nobody believes perfection. If you want someone to trust a lie, you don't make it neat. You don't make it clean. You don't make it dramatic. You make it boring. You make it messy, mundane, forgettable. The kind of details no one would bother inventing because they're too trivial to matter. Except they're not trivial. They're everything. Montague and Cholmondeley began with the basics. Military identity, Major, Royal Marines, combined operations. A position important enough to carry classified documents, but not so senior that every German intelligence officer would know his name. Age, early 30s. Young enough to be active duty, old enough to hold rank. Physical description. They'd match it to the body once they found one. But here's where most operations would stop. Montague's team kept going. They gave him a personality. Major Martin wasn't just a soldier. He was a man. He smoked, he drank, he went to the theater. He had a fiancée, Pam, who worried about him, wrote him letters, got frustrated when he worked too late. He had a father who sent stern, practical advice. He had a bank that sent him overdraft notices. He had a London club that sent him membership renewal reminders. None of this mattered to the invasion plans. All of it mattered to the lie. The team created letters, not military correspondence, personal letters. From Pam. Darling, I'm so glad you're back in London, even if it's only for a few days. I know you can't tell me what you're working on, but please be careful. I miss you terribly. From his father, William. I trust you received the solicitor's letter regarding the estate. These matters require attention, however inconvenient the timing. From his bank. Dear Major Martin, we note your account is currently overdrawn by 79. The letters weren't dramatic. No hints of espionage, no coded messages. Just the tedious, ordinary clutter of a man who had rent to pay, family obligations to manage, and a relationship that existed in stolen moments between deployments. They added receipts, a bill from his London tailor, ticket stubs from a West End theater showing, a receipt for an engagement ring, purchased just weeks earlier. They added keys, house keys, office keys, the kind of worn, everyday metal objects people carry without thinking about them. They even added a photograph. Pam, smiling, looking directly at the camera with the kind of easy affection couples develop over time. Except Pam didn't exist either. The photograph was borrowed from an MI5 clerk who agreed to play the role of a dead man's fiancée for the sake of the war effort. Every detail was tested against one question. Would a German intelligence analyst believe this? Not, would they be impressed? Not, would they be intimidated? Would they believe it? Because the Abwehr weren't amateurs. They'd been running intelligence operations since before the war. They'd caught Allied spies. They'd exposed disinformation campaigns. They knew what fabricated identities looked like. And fabricated identities looked too clean. No personal debts, no messy relationships, no trivial annoyances. Just the operational details, name, rank, mission. But real people are complicated. Real people have unpaid bills and love letters and ticket stubs from nights they wanted to forget about the war for 2 hours. Real people are imperfect, and imperfection is credible. There's a concept in tradecraft that most people never consider. Trust is built through vulnerability. If you want someone to believe you, you don't show them strength. You show them weakness. A soldier who's overdrawn at his bank isn't a propaganda hero. He's human. A man who carries a photograph of his fiancée isn't a calculated intelligence asset. He's in love. The messier Major Martin's life appeared, the safer the operation became. Because the Germans wouldn't be analyzing a cover story. They'd be examining a person. And people don't make sense. They're contradictory, sentimental, financially irresponsible. They carry theater stubs in their pockets weeks after the show because they forgot to throw them away. That's not suspicious. That's life. By March 1943, Major William Martin was complete. He had a service record, a family, a fiancée, debts, plans, a future he'd never live. The identity was so detailed that Montague's team joked they could write his biography. But there was one element they couldn't fake: the body. All the letters in the world wouldn't matter if the corpse didn't match the story. They needed someone who could pass as a Royal Marine in his early 30s. Someone who died recently enough that decomposition wouldn't expose the timeline. Someone whose death wouldn't raise questions. And they needed him to carry the lie convincingly enough that when Spanish authorities found him washed ashore, when German agents examined the briefcase, when intelligence analysts reviewed the documents, everyone would believe Major William Martin died in a plane crash over the Atlantic while carrying classified invasion plans. The search for a body began, and with it, the operation entered the darkest phase of its existence. Because intelligence work isn't just about building lies. Sometimes, it's about repurposing death. There's a moment in every intelligence operation where theory becomes action, where plans written on paper demand something tangible, something irreversible. For Operation Mincemeat, that moment arrived in February 1943, when Ewan Montague sat across from Sir Bernard Spilsbury, one of Britain's most respected pathologists, and asked a question most people never have to ask. Can you help us find a suitable corpse? The documents were ready. The identity was complete. Major William Martin existed in every detail except one. He wasn't real. And for the operation to work, he had to be. Not symbolically, not theoretically, physically. The body would be the delivery system. Everything else, the letters, the receipts, the briefcase full of false invasion plans, would mean nothing if the corpse itself raised suspicion. It had to match the story. Early 30s, male, physically fit enough to pass as a Royal Marine officer. Cause of death had to be consistent with drowning or air crash at sea. And this was the disturbing part. The person had to have died recently enough that decomposition wouldn't betray the timeline. Because once the body washed ashore in Spain, pathologists would examine it. German intelligence would demand answers. The entire lie depended on medical credibility. If the corpse had been dead too long, the deception would collapse before it began. Spilsbury listened carefully. He didn't refuse. He didn't lecture Montague on ethics or the sanctity of the dead. He just asked practical questions. What condition did the body need to be in? What time frame? What cause of death would support the narrative? Then he made calls. To coroners, to hospitals, to morgues across London. Quietly, discreetly, looking for someone who died alone, someone without close family who might ask questions, someone whose death certificate wouldn't attract attention, someone forgotten. They found him in early 1943, a man in his 30s. Cause of death, pneumonia, with fluid in the lungs, which could mimic drowning under certain conditions. No family requesting the body. No next of kin demanding answers. Just a name, a death certificate, and a body in a London mortuary that would otherwise be buried in an unmarked grave. The records don't say who he was. Not his real name, not his story. Not what brought him to die alone in a city at war. That anonymity was intentional. Montague and his team didn't want to know. Knowing made it harder. Because once they knew, the body stopped being an operational asset. It became a person. And they were about to erase whatever life that person had and replace it with a fiction. There's no dignified way to describe what happened next. The body was transferred to a secret location, refrigerated to slow decomposition, examined to ensure it would hold up under Spanish autopsy. Then came the transformation. He was dressed in a Royal Marine uniform, carefully, down to the insignia, the badges, the wear patterns that suggested months of use. The briefcase was chained to his wrist. The pockets were filled. Keys, receipts, letters, theater stubs. A photograph of Pam tucked into his wallet. The identity tags were attached. Major William Martin, 1482228, Royal Marines. And the man who died of pneumonia in a London hospital became, on paper, in uniform, in every official capacity, a British officer carrying invasion plans across the Mediterranean. His death was repurposed into a weapon. Montague didn't write much about this part of the operation. Not because it was classified, though it was, but because there's no way to describe it that doesn't sound monstrous. They took a man who died nameless, unmourned, unnoticed, and they made him a tool. Not for glory, not for recognition, for utility. And yet, if the operation succeeded, that forgotten death would save thousands of lives. Soldiers who'd storm beaches that should have been fortified. Families who'd see their fathers and sons come home. Campaigns that would succeed because the enemy was looking the wrong direction. One unclaimed body, repurposed, could shift the course of the war. Does that justify it? Montague never answered that question directly, but in his private notes, he wrote something that suggests he wrestled with it. We are not proud of this, but we would be less proud to waste lives when we have the means to save them. There's a brutality to intelligence work that doesn't exist in conventional combat. A soldier knows who he's fighting. He can see the enemy. There's a clarity, however terrible, to pulling a trigger. But intelligence officers operate in moral gray zones where clarity doesn't exist. They make decisions with incomplete information. They lie to people who trust them. They weigh hypothetical outcomes against real human costs. And sometimes, they use the dead to protect the living. Not because it's heroic, because it's effective. And in 1943, with the Mediterranean campaign hanging by a thread and 160,000 soldiers preparing to invade Sicily, effectiveness mattered more than comfort. By mid-April, the body was ready. Major William Martin, once a man whose real name would never be recorded, was loaded into a steel canister and transported to a Scottish port. From there, he'd be loaded onto HMS Seraph and carried toward the coast of Spain. The operation had crossed the final threshold. No more planning, no more revisions, no more second-guessing. Once the submarine surfaced and the body entered the water, everything would depend on Spanish authorities finding him, German intelligence examining him, and the Abwehr believing a dead man's lies more than their own strategic logic. The most unsettling part? It was working. Not because the deception was clever, but because the man carrying it, real in death, fake in life, felt human enough to trust, and in war, trust is the deadliest weapon of all. Spain wasn't an accident. Every detail of Operation Mincemeat had been calculated, debated, revised. But the choice of Spain was the most critical decision of all. Not because Spain was safe, because it was dangerous in exactly the right way. In April 1943, Spain was officially neutral. It hadn't joined the Axis. It hadn't joined the Allies. Generalissimo Francisco Franco played both sides carefully, taking aid from Germany while maintaining diplomatic relations with Britain, always positioning Spain to survive, regardless of who won. But neutrality in World War II was never passive. It was a performance, a balancing act, a facade that concealed what everyone knew. Spain was crawling with spies. German intelligence operated openly in major cities: Madrid, Seville, Huelva. The Abwehr had networks, informants, and access to Spanish authorities who were sympathetic to fascism or simply pragmatic about power. British intelligence knew this. They were counting on it. Because the plan wasn't to hide the documents from Germany, it was to let Germany find them, but through a channel they'd trust. If the British leaked invasion plans directly, the Germans would smell a trap. If the plans were found by accident, examined by neutral authorities, and passed along through bureaucratic channels, that felt legitimate. Spain wasn't safe ground. It was the perfect theater for espionage dressed as coincidence. The target location was Huelva, a coastal town in southern Spain near the Portuguese border. Small, quiet, a fishing community with a military presence and, critically, known German intelligence activity. The Abwehr had an agent there, Adolf Klaus, who'd cultivated relationships with local Spanish officials. He was experienced, careful, and connected. If a body washed ashore carrying British military documents, Klaus would hear about it. And if Klaus heard about it, Berlin would hear about it. But here's the problem. The British couldn't control what happened between the beach and Berlin. Once the body entered Spanish territory, the operation belonged to people who had no idea they were part of a deception. Fishermen who might find the body first, local authorities who'd investigate, coroners who'd conduct the autopsy, clerks who'd file the paperwork, Spanish officials who'd decide whether to cooperate with British requests to return the body, or quietly share information with the Germans first. Every single person in that chain could destroy the operation. Not through malice, through procedure. The greatest threat to Operation Mincemeat wasn't the Abwehr's skill. It was bureaucracy. If the Spanish authorities were too efficient, they'd return the body and documents to the British immediately, before German intelligence could examine them. If they were too suspicious, they'd investigate too thoroughly, realize the corpse had been dead longer than the timeline suggested, and expose the deception. If the coroner was too meticulous, he'd notice inconsistencies that raised questions. And if any clerk at any point decided to follow protocol instead of cutting corners, the lie would collapse. Montague and his team couldn't control any of it. They could only hope that human nature, curiosity, ambition, pragmatism would work in their favor. That a Spanish official would make a quiet copy of the documents before returning them. That someone would mention the discovery to the right person. That the information would leak through unofficial channels to German intelligence. And that once the Germans had the documents, they'd believe them. The operation required incompetence and corruption to succeed. Not from the enemy, from neutral bureaucrats who didn't know they were deciding the fate of 160,000 soldiers. There's a paradox at the heart of intelligence work. The more control you have, the less believable the operation becomes. If the British had planted the documents directly with German agents, Berlin would assume deception. If they'd orchestrated the discovery too perfectly, the Abwehr would investigate the chain of custody and find inconsistencies. But if the documents arrived through messy human bureaucratic channels, copied by a clerk who wasn't supposed to, shared by an official currying favor, passed along because someone thought it might be important, that felt real. Because that's how information actually moves in wartime. Not through clean, dramatic handoffs, through ordinary people making small decisions that compound into consequences they never intended. On April 19, 1943, the body, sealed in its canister, was loaded onto HMS Seraph at Holy Loch, Scotland. The submarine's crew knew they were carrying something classified. They didn't know it was a corpse. Lieutenant Commander Norman Jewell, the Seraph's captain, received sealed orders. Proceed to coordinates off the coast of Huelva, Spain. Surface before dawn on April 30th. Release the package into the water approximately 1,600 yards from shore, where currents would carry it toward the beach. Then leave. No confirmation, no observation, no way to know if the plan was working. The submarine traveled south, submerged during daylight, surfacing only at night. For 10 days, the canisters sat in the forward torpedo room. And inside, Major William Martin, a man who died in London, been dressed in a uniform, loaded with false secrets and chained to a briefcase, drifted toward a moment that would decide whether intelligence or firepower would determine the outcome of the Mediterranean campaign. On April 30th, at 4:30 a.m., HMS Seraph surfaced off the Spanish coast. The crew opened the canister. The body was lifted onto the deck, checked one final time, uniform correct, briefcase secure, identity tags in place. At 4:37 a.m., Major William Martin entered the water. The current took him. The submarine submerged, and from that moment, the operation belonged to tides, fishermen, bureaucrats, and chance. The British had lost control. Now they could only wait and hope that somewhere in Spain, curiosity would outweigh caution, and the documents would reach the one person who could change the war. A German intelligence officer who believed in paperwork more than instinct. April 30th, 1943, 4:37 a.m. The body enters the water. No ceremony, no words. Just the sound of the Atlantic closing over Major William Martin as the current pulls him toward the Spanish coast. Lieutenant Commander Jewell watches for 30 seconds, then gives the order, "Take her down." HMS Seraph submerges into darkness, and with it, any chance of controlling what happens next. There's a kind of terror unique to intelligence work that has nothing to do with combat. A soldier can fight back, a pilot can evade, a sailor can maneuver. But an intelligence officer, sitting in a basement office in London, can only wait. And waiting is the worst part. Because once an operation crosses into the real world, once the documents leave your hands and enter someone else's, you lose everything that mattered in the planning phase. Control, adjustment, intervention. All you have left is hope. And hope doesn't win wars. Montague and his team knew this moment was coming. They'd spent months preparing for it. Building the identity, finding the body, coordinating with the submarine crew. But knowing doesn't make it easier. The instant the body touched the water, Operation Mincemeat stopped being a British intelligence operation. It became a series of unpredictable human reactions. Would a fisherman find the body? Would Spanish authorities investigate thoroughly or quickly? Would the coroner notice inconsistencies? Would the briefcase stay sealed? Or would someone open it out of curiosity? Would the documents reach German intelligence? And if they did, would the Germans believe them? Every single question depended on people Montague would never meet, making decisions he couldn't influence, in a country where Britain had no operational control. The plan required a fisherman to care enough to report the body instead of ignoring it. A Spanish official to be curious enough to examine the briefcase, but not suspicious enough to investigate too deeply. A clerk to make unauthorized copies of classified documents, violating protocol, because he thought it might be useful. A German intelligence officer to trust the evidence over his own strategic instincts. And all of this had to happen without any guidance from London. If even one person in that chain made a different decision, followed procedure instead of instinct, reported to the wrong superior, dismissed the documents as trivial, the operation would fail. And 160,000 soldiers preparing to invade Sicily would hit fortified beaches defended by troops who knew they were coming. Back in London, Montague returned to his office. There was nothing to do. No reports to file, no agents to coordinate, no messages to send. Sending messages would be the worst possible move. Any communication between London and Spain, any unusual activity, could draw attention to the operation. So the intelligence officers who'd spent months building Major William Martin sat at their desks and did nothing. They couldn't call Spanish authorities to ask if a body had been found. They couldn't contact German intelligence to see if the documents had been passed along. They couldn't send agents to Huelva to observe the situation. Any intervention would expose the deception. The only thing they could do was wait for confirmation. And confirmation would only come if the Germans acted on the information. Not with words, with movement. Troop deployments, defensive reinforcements, strategic adjustments visible through reconnaissance and ultra-intercepts. But that would take weeks, maybe longer. And until then, silence. This is the part of intelligence work that no one talks about. Not the clever plans, not the daring operations, not the moments of triumph, but the waiting. The days of checking reports that say nothing new, the nights wondering if the operation failed, and you just don't know it yet. The realization that you've done everything you can. And now the outcome depends entirely on chance and human behavior. Two things you can't predict and can't control. Montague later wrote, "We had launched the plan. Now we could only hope that the ocean, the Spanish authorities, and the Germans would all do their part." But he didn't write about the weight of those days. The knowledge that if the plan failed, he'd know, intellectually, that he'd tried his best, followed the strategy, done everything right. But thousands of soldiers would still die. And no amount of strategic justification changes that. May 1st, nothing. May 2nd, nothing. May 3rd. A report comes through, vague, unconfirmed, that a body washed ashore near Huelva. Spanish authorities recovered it, identified as a British officer. But no details, no mention of documents, no indication whether the briefcase was examined or simply returned to British custody unopened. Montague reads the report 3 times. It doesn't tell him what he needs to know. May 4th, another report. The body is being held for investigation. May 5th, still no confirmation about the documents. May 6th, British diplomats in Madrid received the briefcase, officially sealed, supposedly untouched. But was it? Did Spanish authorities open it first? Did they photograph the contents? Did they share the information? There's no way to know. Opening the briefcase to check if it had been tampered with would defeat the entire purpose. If the Germans were watching, and they were always watching, any sign that the British cared too much about the documents would signal deception. So Montague's team examined the seal carefully, looked for signs of disturbance. The wax looked intact. But wax can be remelted. Seals can be replicated. They couldn't be certain. And certainty is the one thing intelligence officers crave most and receive least. May 7th, May 8th, May 9th, days pass. The invasion of Sicily is scheduled for July 10th. Planning continues. Ships are loaded. Troops are briefed. And in a basement office in London, Ewan Montague waits for the only confirmation that matters. German behavior. Not words, not captured documents, not intercepted communications discussing whether they believe the lie, but action. Troop movements, redeployments, changes in defensive priorities visible through reconnaissance. Because intelligence victories aren't proven through confessions. They're proven when the enemy commits resources based on information you gave them. The waiting continues. And somewhere off the coast of Spain, a dead man carrying false secrets drifts through bureaucratic channels toward the one moment that will decide whether intelligence can change the course of a war, or whether 160,000 soldiers will die because a fisherman made the wrong choice, a clerk followed procedure, or a German officer trusted his instincts over paperwork. Control is gone. Only consequences remain. May 11th, 1943. A coded message arrives at the British Naval Attaché's office in Madrid. Routine, bureaucratic. The kind of communication that crosses diplomatic desks a dozen times a day. It confirms that Major William Martin's body has been examined by Spanish authorities and is ready for burial with full military honors. The briefcase has been returned to British custody. That's all. No mention of whether the documents were read. No indication of German interest. No way to know if the operation succeeded or failed. But Montague notices something. The return of the briefcase took longer than it should have. Not dramatically longer. Just long enough. Long enough for someone to open it. Photograph the contents. Reseal it carefully, long enough for curiosity to override protocol. It's not proof, but it's possibility. And in intelligence work, possibility is sometimes all you get. May 14th. An ultra-intercept, decoded German communication, arrives at Bletchley Park. It's fragmented, incomplete, but the subject line is clear. Greece, not Sicily, not Italy, Greece. The message references Allied invasion preparations, mentions force strengths, discusses defensive priorities. It's vague, cautious, but it's there. Someone in Berlin is taking the idea of a Greek invasion seriously. Montague reads the intercept twice. Still not confirmation. Could be coincidence. Could be existing German concerns about the Balkans. But the timing is suspicious. And in deception operations, suspicious timing is the closest thing to victory you'll see. May 19th. Another intercept. This one more specific. German High Command discussing defensive reinforcements in the Eastern Mediterranean. References to Sardinia. Concerns about Allied movements toward Greece and the Aegean. Sicily is mentioned once, as a likely diversion. Montague feels something he hasn't allowed himself to feel in weeks. Hope. Not certainty, not triumph, but the faint, fragile sense that the lie might be working. The confirmation doesn't come through dramatic intercepted confessions. No German officer sends a message saying, "We have been deceived." Intelligence victories are never that clean. Instead, the truth emerges through behavior. Late May, reconnaissance photographs show German troop movements. Panzer divisions repositioning from Sicily toward Greece. Defensive installations being reinforced. In Sardinia, Luftwaffe squadrons redeploying eastward. Not all at once. Not with obvious panic. Just adjustments. The kind of strategic shifts that happen when a military believes, deeply, confidently, that they know where the enemy is coming, and they're preparing for the wrong place. June 3rd. An intercepted communication from Berlin to Field Marshal Kesselring in Italy. It is confirmed that the Anglo-American forces will strike Greece and Sardinia. Sicily is a deception. Defensive priorities are to be adjusted accordingly. Montague reads it, then reads it again. The Germans didn't just believe the lie. They confirmed it as fact. Somewhere in the chain, from the Spanish beach to the coroner's office to a clerk's desk to German intelligence in Madrid to the Abwehr headquarters in Berlin, the documents were examined, analyzed, debated, and trusted. Not because they were perfect, but because they were human, because Major William Martin felt real. His letters felt authentic. His receipts, his debts, his love for Pam. It all felt lived in, messy, true. The Germans didn't just read documents. They met a person, and they believed him. This is the moment intelligence officers live for. Not applause, not recognition, not medals pinned to uniforms in public ceremonies, but behavioral confirmation. The enemy committing resources, troops, ships, aircraft, based on information you gave them. The enemy making decisions that weaken their position because they trust a story you built from lies and corpses and theater ticket stubs. There's no celebration. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the most dangerous part of warfare isn't firepower. It's certainty. And the Allies had just weaponized Germany's certainty against them. June 12th. More intercepts, more reconnaissance, more confirmation. German forces in Greece are at their highest alert levels. Sardinian defenses have been reinforced with additional divisions. And Sicily. Sicily has been deprioritized, not abandoned. Germany wasn't careless, but the intensity of preparation, the focus, the commitment of elite forces, gone. Redirected to beaches the Allies had no intention of touching. Montague writes a brief memo to his superiors. Mincemeat swallowed whole. 3 words, no elaboration needed. The operation had succeeded. July 10th, 1943. 160,000 Allied troops land on the beaches of Sicily. They expect resistance. They expect casualties. They expect a fight. But they don't expect what they find. Lighter defenses than anticipated. Fewer troops. Less coordinated resistance. Confusion in German command about whether this is the real invasion or still part of the deception. The landings aren't bloodless. War is never bloodless. But they're survivable. Units that should have been destroyed in the first wave make it to shore. Beachheads that should have collapsed hold. The invasion that could have been a catastrophe becomes a success. Not because the Allies were stronger, not because the Germans were weaker, but because the Wehrmacht committed forces to the wrong place at the wrong time, chasing an invasion that never came. Defending beaches the Allies never intended to touch. All because they believed a dead man's story. Back in London, Montague receives the reports. Casualty figures. Strategic assessments. Confirmation that Sicily has been secured faster and with fewer losses than projected. He doesn't celebrate. He sits at his desk, exhausted, and thinks about the man whose body made this possible. The man whose name they never recorded. Who died alone, unmourned, unclaimed, who became Major William Martin for a few weeks in the spring of 1943. And who, without ever knowing it, changed the war. There's an uncomfortable truth about intelligence work that most people never consider. Victory doesn't feel like victory. It feels like relief. Relief that the plan worked, that the lie held, that the gamble paid off. But also relief tinged with something darker, the knowledge that thousands of soldiers are alive because of a corpse, a forged identity, and a briefcase full of lies. That wars are won not by courage or strength, but by making the enemy believe the wrong story. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon in the world isn't a bomb or a bullet. It's belief itself. When people remember World War II, they remember beaches, Normandy, Iwo Jima, Dunkirk. They remember soldiers storming through machine gun fire. Tanks rolling across European fields, aircraft dogfighting over the English Channel. The visible war, the loud war, the war captured in photographs and newsreels and monuments. But there was another war happening simultaneously, a war fought in silence, in basement offices, in forged documents, in the space between what the enemy knew and what they thought they knew. And that war, the invisible one, decided outcomes just as decisively as any battle. Operation Mincemeat wasn't an outlier. It was part of a broader transformation in how wars are won. By 1943, British intelligence had built an entire system of deception operations, each one designed to manipulate German strategic thinking. Double agents feeding false information to Berlin while appearing loyal to the Reich. Controlled leaks through neutral channels, crafted to look accidental but designed to shape enemy expectations. Long-term narrative manipulation, planting seeds of false intelligence months in advance, letting them grow, watching the Germans commit resources based on patterns that never existed. Operation Mincemeat was the most dramatic example. But it wasn't alone. Operation Fortitude, the deception campaign before D-Day, convinced Germany that the Normandy invasion was a diversion and the real attack would come at Calais. German forces stayed in Calais for weeks after Normandy, waiting for an invasion that never came. The double-cross system turned captured German spies into British assets, feeding Berlin a steady diet of lies disguised as intelligence reports. The entire Allied intelligence apparatus had shifted from reactive, gathering information, to proactive, shaping what the enemy believed. And it worked. Not because the Germans were incompetent, but because belief is harder to fight than bullets. Here's the uncomfortable truth about World War II. Millions of lives, soldiers, civilians, families, turned on decisions made by men who never fired a shot. Intelligence officers in London deciding which lies to tell. Forgers in back rooms creating identities detailed enough to fool trained investigators. Pathologists helping find corpses that could carry classified documents. And the enemy, believing what they were meant to believe. The soldiers who landed in Sicily didn't know they were alive because of a dead man's briefcase. The families who welcomed them home didn't know that German divisions had been sent to Greece based on fabricated invasion plans. The visible war, the one people saw and remembered, was shaped by the invisible one. And the invisible war was fought with stories. There's a reason deception works in warfare. It's not because people are gullible. It's because war is built on incomplete information. No commander knows everything. No intelligence service sees the whole picture. So they make decisions based on the information they trust most. And trust isn't built through dramatic revelations. It's built through consistency, detail, and human fallibility. A love letter feels real because real people write love letters. A bank overdraft notice feels authentic because real officers have financial problems. Theater ticket stubs feel mundane because real lives are full of mundane details. The Germans didn't fail because they were careless. They failed because British intelligence understood something fundamental about human psychology. We trust what feels human more than what feels strategic. And Major William Martin, with his debts, his fiancée, his clutter, felt human. So they believed him. After the war, the truth about Operation Mincemeat remained classified for decades. The body was buried in Spain. The grave marked Major William Martin, Royal Marines. A man who never existed, remembered under a name that wasn't his. The families of the soldiers who survived Sicily never knew why the defenses were lighter than expected. The historians who documented the Mediterranean campaign never understood, until the files were declassified, that the entire strategic picture had been shaped by a corpse and a briefcase. The invisible war stayed invisible, but its consequences echoed through every operation that followed. Modern intelligence agencies study Operation Mincemeat not as history, but as doctrine, because it proved something that changed warfare forever. You don't need to be stronger than the enemy. You just need them to be wrong about where you're coming from. There's a photograph from the operation that Montague kept in his files. Not of the body, not of the documents. A photograph of Pam, the woman who didn't exist, borrowed from an MI5 clerk, tucked into Major Martin's wallet. She's smiling, looking at the camera with easy affection. And somewhere in Spain, a German intelligence officer examined that photograph, saw a man in love and believed the story, because stories are more powerful than facts. Facts can be questioned, analyzed, verified. But stories, messy, human, imperfect stories, feel true. And in war, what feels true becomes strategy. World War II was decided by tanks and planes and soldiers. But it was also decided by a dead man carrying false secrets, a forged love letter that made a German officer trust what he read, a series of small human details that convinced an entire military apparatus to commit forces to the wrong invasion. The war you never see. The one fought with belief instead of bullets. The one where victory doesn't come from strength, but from making the enemy certain of the wrong answer. Operation Mincemeat succeeded because it understood something most people never consider. Wars are not only fought with weapons, they are fought with stories. Stories about where you're going, who you are, what you intend to do. And if you can control the story the enemy believes, you control the war. Somewhere off the coast of Spain, a body entered the water on April 30th, 1943. He carried no weapon, fired no shot, charged no beach. But he changed the course of the Mediterranean campaign, not through courage, through deception. And sometimes, when the stakes are high enough, when the costs are unbearable, when the only alternative is mass slaughter, the dead speak louder than armies.